Today we're going to start on the square root property. Okay. So really it's just a twist on what we've been using anyway. So far we've used where, let's say, if both sides, let's say square root of 8 equals square root of x. Then if we square both sides, we just have x equals 8. Well, instead of squaring both sides, we're just going to apply the square root to both sides, which is pretty much the same thing. So far, we have squared both sides. Okay, so with the square root property, basically states for any non-negative number, and we'll call that number c. It could be anything from 0 all the way to positive infinity. If, let's say, x squared equals some number c, then you can square root both sides. So the square root of x squared equals square root of c, or in this case, plus or minus. So x equals either positive square root of c, or x can equal negative square root of c. All right, so let's say, for example, if you wanted to solve x squared equals 49. Okay. Now, so far, how we've been doing it, we subtract 49 from both sides. That gives us x squared minus 49 equals 0, which is a difference of squares. So that would be x squared minus 7 squared equals 0. And for difference of squares, it's x plus 7 times x minus 7 equals 0. So if we solve both of those, it will be x equals negative 7 and x equals 7. But using the square root property, we don't have to go through all of that anymore. So if you use the square root property, we have x squared equals 49. We just square root both sides. So the square root of x squared, that cancels out and just gives you x. So that's plus or minus the square root of 49, where we know the square root of 49 is 7, since 7 times 7 is 49. So x can equal either positive or negative 7, which is the same answer we got up here with a lot less work. All right. Any questions on that one? All right. I'll leave that up for a few seconds. Sure. All right. Okay, so let's say here we go. For example, if we wanted to solve let's say x squared minus 12 equals 0. Make that a little bit neater. Okay. So really all we'd have to do is just get the x squared by itself. So if we add 12 to both sides, we have x squared equals positive 12. And then we apply the square root property. Okay, so we just go ahead and square root both sides. So the square root of x squared equals plus or minus the square root of 12. Draw a little arrow there. Okay, the square and the square root cancel each other out. So we have x equals positive or negative square root of 12. Now in some cases, if you can't reduce the 12 anymore, you just leave it there. But because 12 is 4 times 3, we can reduce it a little bit. Okay, so since 12 is 4 times 3, square root of 12 can equal square root of 4 times square root of 3. Square root of 4 is 2, so that's 2 square root of 3. Okay, so your answer is going to equal x equals either positive or negative 2 square root of 3. Now, if that would have been like square root of 13, you would have just left it as square root of 13. So. All right. Any questions on that one? All right. Let's say for our next example, I like that one. I'll use that one next. Bring that up a little bit. Let's say if we wanted to solve for x squared plus 25 equals 0. Okay, so just like we did before, the first thing you want to do is get the x squared by itself. Okay, so if we subtract 25 from both sides, you have 4x squared equals negative 25. And divide both sides by 4. You have x squared equals negative 25 divided by 4. Okay. So once we have the x squared by itself, we apply the square root property. Okay. So we just go ahead and square root both sides. So we have the square root of x squared equals the square root of negative 25 over 4. Okay. Now, since you have a negative square root, you can just go ahead and take that negative out and make it an I. Square and the square root cancels out, so that just becomes x. So you have the square root of 25 over 4, I. And remember, when you have a square root of a quotient, you can just get the square root and apply it to both the numerator and denominator. So that's x equals square root of 25 over square root of 4i. Oh, move that up a little bit. Okay. Oh, plus or minus, forgot about that. Which I was just about to say, don't forget about your plus or minus, and I just forgot about my plus or minus. So. Okay, so x equals either positive or negative square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 4 is 2. I. So sometimes they'll want you to put your answer like that. If not, then they may have you separate those two to where x can equal positive 5 over 2i or negative 5 over 2i. They'll usually tell you which form they want the answer in. That looks like it's a bit dark. Uh-oh. Did that help any? Hopefully it didn't make it worse. All right, so any questions on that one? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to use the square root property to actually solve equations, which is the main idea, more complicated ones. So what if we want to use the square root property? Let me show you. To solve, say x minus 1 squared equals 16. Right. So for this one, you can't get the x squared by itself because it's part of something a little bit bigger. So you just want to get that x minus 1 squared by itself. So this is already by itself, so we don't have to worry about that. So x minus 1 squared is already isolated. Okay. And you'll see in future examples where sometimes it's not by itself and you have to make it by itself. But for this one, we don't have to worry about that. Okay. So we just square root both sides. We'll apply square root property to both sides. Okay. So if you have x minus 1 squared equals 16, just square root that side, and don't forget your plus or minus. Move that over just a hair. Okay, so you want to remember your plus or minus. Okay, so once again, the square and the square root cancel each other out. So you have x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 16, which is 4. Okay. So now to solve for our x, we just have to add 1 to both sides. Okay, so x equals, now you don't add the 1 to this just yet. Right now, it's just 1 plus or minus 4. Okay, so that plus or minus means we just separate it. So that means x can equal 1 plus 4, or x can equal 1 minus 4. All right, did that make sense? All right. Okay, so now we just solve both of them for x. So x can equal 5, or x can equal 1 minus 4, which is negative 3. Oh, there we go. And if you wanted to check them, you can by just plugging them into your original equation. And we'll do a quick check. Okay, so that's x minus 1 squared equals 16. If x is equal to 5, then that's 5 minus 1 squared equals 16, which is 4 squared equals 16, which is true. Now, if x is equal to negative 3, that's negative 3 minus 1 squared equals 16, which is negative 4 squared equals 16, which again is true. Surprised I didn't yawn yet. That's usually contagious. All right, any questions on that one? All right. Okay, still writing. All right. Oops. All right, so let's say if we have the example of, if we wanted to solve, let me pick a good one. 7x squared minus 10 equals negative 3. Yep, bring that up just a bit. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. Once again, the first thing you want to do is get the x squared by itself. So if you have 7x squared, if we add 10 to both sides, those two become 0, so they disappear. It would be 7x squared equals 3 negative, well, minus 3 over, well, plus 10 would be plus 7. And if we divide both sides by 7, we get x squared equals 1. Oh, plus or minus. Well, we didn't square root yet, so we don't use plus or minus. Okay, so now we have the x squared by itself. We'll apply the square root property. Okay, so you have the square root of x squared equals plus or minus the square root of 1. So the square and the square root cancel each other out here. So we just end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of 1 is just 1, so that's just 1. Or if they wanted you to expand it, x equals 1 or x equals negative 1. Either one. All right. Any questions on that one? Okay. Let's get a good one here. Okay, so let's say if we have, I'll start on a new sheet. I don't know if I should be able to finish it on this one. Okay, so let's say if we wanted to solve x squared minus 120 equals 100. Okay, so we get the x squared by itself, so that means we just have to add 120 to both sides. Okay, so x squared minus 120 equals 100. Add 120 to both sides. Uh-oh, got the 1 there. There we go. Okay, these two cancel out, so that disappears. That leaves us with x squared equals 220. So now we can apply the square root property. Uh-oh. Okay, so if we square root both sides, and not forget our plus or minus, that gives us x equals plus or minus the square root of 220. Okay. But since 220 is 55 times 4, or 4 times 55, since I'm going to do it that way, that means the square root of 220 is equal to the square root of 4 times 55, which I should have separated that already, but one extra step won't hurt. So we go ahead and separate those two. So you have 2 square root of 55. Okay. So that means, let me separate that. This becomes x equals plus or minus 2 square root of 55. Okay, you can write it this way, or you can separate it if you want to. All right, any questions on that one? Yes.
So like for like on the test,
Mm-hmm.
like on the right side where it says 2 square root 55,
Mm-hmm.
if we put the like plus minus like on that part, do we have to make like an extra step, or can we just add it to this? Like do we have to have an extra step to make it positive and negative, or can we just add it to like one to the right?
Oh, you mean on which step? Let me.
Like the last part, do we
This.
have to have that like extra step, or can we just add the plus and minus to the two?
Oh, you mean if you just have the plus or minus there, or do you have to put it separate?
Yeah, do we have to put it separate?
Oh, no, no. Yeah, if you left it like that on a test, that'd be okay.
Okay.
But I think on the homework, they want it separate.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Okay, so let's see. Let me pick a good one here. All right. Okay, so I'll give you one to start on. Okay, so use the square root property to solve 2x squared minus 50 equals 100. All right, now I'll give you a few minutes to start on that one. So for this one, remember the first thing you have to do is get the x squared by itself. Okay, so we add 50 to both sides. We have 2x squared equals 100. Well, I might as well write it all out. Minus 50 equals 100. And add 50 to both sides. And that gives us 2x squared equals 150. Then divide both sides by 2. X squared equals 75. Okay. So now we apply the square root property. So we have the square root of x squared equals plus or minus the square root of 75. Square root and square cancels out. So you have x equals plus or minus square root of 75. But we know that 75 is equal to 25 times 3. So the square root of 75 equals the square root of 25 times the square root of 3, which is 5 square root of 3. Separate that a little bit. That means x is equal to positive or negative 5 square root of 3. All right. Any questions on that one? Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's say, for example, we wanted to solve, say, 4x plus 6 squared minus 8 equals 56.